Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Shazam number 15, the final issue in this particular series. Though I assume Shazam will be back in some form or another soon enough. He's like a film franchise now, so well, we'll talk a little bit about that later and what I think the future of this character might be. For now, let's talk about this issue itself. We reviewed Shazam number 14 and I talked about my impressions of it. It really was Jeff Johns kind of wrapping up his series. And issue number 15 is actually written by uh, Jeff Loveness. Brandon Pearson does the artwork and the cover. Mike Adieu does the coloring. And Rob Lay does the lettering. We've talked about Jeff Loveness before because he did one of the quote-unquote filler arcs for Justice League, the Overlords storyline, which I thought was a really interesting take on the Justice League having to take over... Wait, did he do that? Or did he do... Hang on a sec. Now I'm not entirely sure. Oh well. I feel like he did that or the Orchid one, and in either case, they were both pretty interesting takes on the Justice League, and I feel it reminded me of that with Loveness. Karsten Logan, Johnny DC, thanks for joining us. Mixed with that is really solid artwork that I think nicely sells this series, like as its final little issue. Peterson does a really good job at giving sort of like cartoony feel to it, but the facial expressions are pretty realistic and the balance is nicely struck between the two so that when the characters are just sitting down and talking, as they do quite a bit in this issue, it's still interesting looking. And then we have really good coloring. There's a big fight against a giant robot, fire, a lot of different types of shading we get from different things. No, this is from Team 4 Star from way back in the day. I'm probably like one of 30 people that has this shirt. But anyways, so the Shazam book's pretty strong overall, but it is a little sad to see the series go. I definitely think I would recommend it as a standalone Shazam book. It's pretty great. It has some stuff to say about superheroes in general because of Loveness and his kind of thoughtful writing, which we got out of Justice League. And it's kind of interesting because Loveness is, if I'm recalling correctly, a writer from like Rick and Morty comics and stuff like that. So his superhero stuff with DC so far has been comparatively very deep and really gets into some interesting stuff. Carson was saying, have you seen the movie of Shazam? Definitely. I think I've seen it a couple of times now. I quite like it. We've talked about it on the channel before when we were ranking movies where Batman appeared in, and we counted that for some reason. But I really like Shazam. I think I like it more than most people. I particularly like the angle of him being like a foster kid and that sort of thing. So I really like this particular series and how much it kind of let the character drift towards that movie, which I think was a positive decision. Vad says, what do you think of Superboy Prime's return in Shazam and Death Metal? We've talked about both actually in previous reviews, which you can check out. Broadly, I think it's pretty interesting. I do feel Superboy Prime gets a little bit of flack, and perhaps rightfully so, for kind of being, to a degree, a superhero throwing a temper tantrum simply because like he like was upset, or I don't know what his deal was in Infinite Crisis, but I do like just the raw, unhinged power of a truly disturbed Superman. I think that's quite interesting and can be used well, so him returning and potentially being a threat again in other stories sounds pretty cool to me. So, let's get into what this book's about a bit. We open on Shazam fighting a giant robot in Tokyo. It's pretty fun between like some of the banter and stuff. Like, it's just classic goofy superhero stuff, but there's some fun little moments. And his interaction with the crowd I found pretty fun. Karsten says, what do you think of Billy in Deceased? I honestly don't even remember what happened to him exactly. I remember Black Adam for sure. But I don't recall what happened with Billy. I guess I've just lost it in the deluge of Deceased content. So Shazam flies back home to Philadelphia, and due to the time zone differences, which is a fun little detail, because it's like night in Japan, but it is time for school back home. And Billy quickly rushes in, completely unprepared for class. There's a substitute teacher in, and she asks for Billy's report on Reconstructionism after the Civil War. And he says, well, I'm going to be honest, that's so boring, I can't even lie about that. And he says, like, why don't we talk about any of the like cool things that happened? Shazam just punched a robot's head off in Japan. That was pretty cool. He goes on a whole little rant. The teacher says, are we done? And then she says, well, I think you make a good point. And the next page is spent discussing superheroes, kind of, and sort of their role of history and what I recognize as sociology, basically, and why. Like, she poses two questions for them: why Lex Luthor hasn't been locked up for good, and why the Joker keeps escaping. Which has certainly been well discussed before. But once again, Loveness takes these well explored, because that's kind of what he did with Justice League. It's really bugging me now. I'm not sure which of the two stories he did. It was Vendetti who did one. Johnny DC says, have you read Death Metal Multiverse End? I have to just pick that book up, actually. I do have that in the tank, and we'll be talking about that in the future. What is? Anyways, so Loveness did the Black Orchid story in Justice League recently, and basically it's the same, like, it's a similar kind of story where Batman and the Justice League got confronted with their inner desires and went on a whole little psychic journey. That's literally like the plot line of a recent Batman issue. But when Loveness did the Justice League story, he was able to kind of add something to a well-explored area and kind of add to the conversation a little bit. And he kind of does the same thing here. So she talks about how, like, it's easy to cheer for Superman arresting Lex Luthor, but then he ultimately is able to go free, and they let him go right back to exploiting everybody because LexCorp gas is $2 cheaper. Everyone loves it when Batman chases Joker through Gotham in a $1 billion tank, but when it comes to funding mental health and the proper security and resources to keep someone like the Joker contained, the money's just not there. And I really like this discussion because I feel like that's a very coherent way of stating things that hasn't necessarily been done before when it comes to stuff like how these supervillains keep escaping from Arkham, or how Lex Luthor keeps maintaining not only freedom but power and wealth. It all reeks of plausibility to me in a way I hadn't really thought about before. But that makes a lot of sense. Does it not? Carlos Lopez says the Superboy Prime fight was weak. People talked about that in the last issue, and I was a little defensive of it, but, a month out from that now, and I'm kind of agreeing with you guys there. It was a little underplayed, in part because that Shazam issue was doing so many other things. It would have been nice for Superboy Prime's return to be a little more devoted to Superboy Prime, but he was really just a footnote in all of that, which the only cool thing of that makes me think, oh, well, that's them kind of backdooring in this character for him to potentially be used more in the future or something. Oh. Yeah, well, we could talk about that later, Johnny DC. I assume that's some reference to Multiverse End about the timeline or something. We'll have to get into that. But I haven't read any of those books from this week quite yet. So Carson says, could you see Billy losing his powers? Not I mean, I can see it in general, but at the moment, no, because Shazam's character has a big, bright future. We'll save that until I'm done kind of reviewing this for now. Um, but Shazam kind of takes this to heart, and he later encounters Aquaman, and they talk a little bit about like this. He asks if they're making the world better. Is the world better because of superheroes like them, knowing Aquaman's more experienced? But Aquaman just kind of brushes the question off, saying like, "Oh, a whale talked to me, asked me to come alone." I don't love some of the jokier lines in this book, but they're not horribly intrusive in a book like Shazam. Later, he encounters his teacher, caught in a horrible fire in her apartment that consumes the entire building. um, but Billy is able to save everyone, and he even flies his teacher out and gets her to safety. It's a nice little moment, and that really gets into like the artwork of this book, the coloring. The fire really feels big and vivid, and even though Shazam's very powerful because he's young and inexperienced, and he's like talking to the people in the burning building, being like, "I don't have frostbite, I'm not Superman. Y'all gotta run!" while he's like holding the roof up. It's a different dynamic than how even like Spider-Man would be in that situation, or let alone Superman or something like that, which I quite like because Shazam could very easily solve that problem, kind of knowing the full extent of his powers, like with his speed and all of that, but he doesn't necessarily have those instincts or anything, which I think is right for his character. So he ends up like the teacher watches her building go up in flames, and he kind of is going to do that thing where he just flies off, but in a moment I really like, he sees her just weeping at this, comes back and hugs her. Thanks for joining us, Karsten. He's got to go, but always great hearing from you. So he goes to a diner with the teacher, and they start chatting, and she mentions how like she moved here for a fresh start and all this stuff, and she talks about how hard it is to make a difference in these kids. And now she's lost everything, and they kind of go through all of that. It's really interesting because Billy obviously is one of her students, so he has that uh, particular perspective of like her talking about him to an extent, but also just her students in general and how like her own like it's just interesting. You probably didn't think of like this substitute teacher as like this person with like vulnerability and struggling herself, but being able to talk to her as an adult was probably very eye-opening in a way that few other teenagers would experience. John Rhodes, thanks for joining us. He's saying he enjoys my opinions, which is always nice to hear. So they overhear this guy saying like, "Oh no, a robot's attacking Montreal," and he flies off to go deal with that. That joke I liked because this book begins and ends with giant robots attacking different cities. Shazam returns to school. Well, like Billy finds his teacher, like, you know, kind of sitting quietly alone in an empty classroom. And he kind of walks in and says, "Oh, I thought a lot about what you said yesterday," which, to be fair, is very true. And um, he he just kind of says like, "Oh, I really appreciate like what you're doing and stuff." Then she asks if he has that report on the Civil War, or well, I guess Reconstructionism, and he obviously does not because he was busy. And she's like, "Oh, what's your excuse? Like my apartment burned down," and like she starts giving him crap. And that's the ending of the book. Like that's the final panel, which I think is a beautiful little moment to end not only the book on, but the series. It's a strong standalone book that, like I said, has a lot to say about superheroes. I think it had some interesting points. It leaves things on a nice, kind of bittersweet note in my eyes. It's a very happy little book with a lot of little jokes and stuff along the way and fun moments where Shazam gets to be Shazam. But as a closing to a like pretty fun series, but like also just like a final little statement on the character, it was nice. But that's all weighed against the series ending, and there's sort of a sad feeling of that because this and quite a few other DC books out there are going without a clear path of what's going to happen to like the Teen Titans or Shazam going forward. And I'm curious about that. I don't know if it's going to be something such as him joining the Justice League, which is always potentially interesting, or him serving in some other capacity, or them potentially relaunching the series in some form or another one day, or doing a miniseries. All of these possibilities along the way. I will say, if this is some sort of preview of Loveness potentially taking on Shazam as a long-term writer, because it kind of feels like they're flirting with that with him doing the Justice League book and now this, I'm all for it. Loveness has really shown that he's got some interesting stuff to say about superheroes that few others, I believe, have ever really said before, and especially not so coherently. So I'm excited about that and curious to see what this guy ends up doing for DC going forward. Because so far, he's really presented some interesting stuff. I haven't really checked out his like Rick and Morty books. They're not. I assume they're a lot more jokey, and I don't know how much I love his sense of humor, but his more serious toned superhero writing and even his more fun actiony stuff is great, and I'm very curious to see what he does with it. It's very creative and vivid, and he makes excellent use of a comic's ability to showcase artwork and really tell a story without the limitations of a budget or special effects or anything like that. I am thinking of the Justice League story as much as this one, though. And this one doesn't have a lot of crazy, huge stuff, but it knows when to go big and when to have a little bit of fun, even just for a page or a panel. JX3 was saying, I always heard that the popular heroes are the ones with the great rogues gallery, like Batman with Joker, Riddler, etc., or Spider-Man with Green Goblin, so on and so forth. Does Shazam have enough villains besides Black Adam? I would say yes. A lot of those villains are obscure to the point that I don't even know them, but a lot of them could be reworked and built on. But you also have Savannah, who's great. You have Mr. Mind and other potential DC villains. That last book, Shazam number 14, showed a whole showcase of different potential villains and magical creatures that Shazam and his family could potentially fight. And I really think there is a franchise there that can be built on without us having to go to the Black Adam well. In some ways, I think it's strong of DC not to just immediately link him with his evil counterpart that's just basically an evil version of him, quite literally. Mr. Mind and Savannah are more interesting villains, and though I know less about Shazam in general from what I've seen from his books, there's more potential characters out there that can be built on, even if they aren't these big names, like on the level of those like him or that, or even like Superboy Prime. Although, because DC is flexible in what villains can go where, I think there's a lot of possibility beyond that too, if they really want to. And, you know, they can always make new villains and build up stuff like that, but you really need to invest in a series and sell people on it. In some part, I think you need someone other than, like, the same old talent, like, beyond Jeff Johns to do it. Maybe Loveness is that guy, but perhaps, like, just a really creative team or someone like, you know, big, like Grant Morrison to really take a swing at the character will undoubtedly leave some lasting changes and build up on it further if that doesn't exist. But I feel it does. There's decades and decades of Shazam comics, and Captain Marvel comics, but I don't know a lot about them and all of the foes they've faced over time. We haven't even really like gotten into in any major media adaptation, like the Tiger guy and those red uniform people and all that stuff. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to know that there's a big well in there. Tevye Smoka, thanks for joining us. He was saying that he's sad that like this is ending. I agree. This series has been strong, even if I haven't read like all the books. From what I've gotten out of it, it's been pretty great. He also agrees with what I was saying that Shazam does have enough to carry a franchise. I don't know if it's on the same level of Batman or Spider-Man, like JX3 was mentioning, and if you're going on that specific level, I would say no. But the number of superheroes and even teams that actually qualify on that level is relatively limited in comparison. Taki Tani, Tevye is saying in chat, that's a good on too. I forgot about that. I do know her. Yes, I think. If I'm maybe like I said, I'm not an expert. Thanks for joining us, Mohid Zishan. And Tiffy was saying the Monster Society of Evil are awesome. Yeah, that would be great. Like a lot of stuff explored in this book would be pretty strong. Uh, and those magical lands, I talked about that being a potential future direction of Shazam, beyond just even like potentially a trilogy of movies or whatever they have planned for that film franchise. Like that could carry a TV show pretty easily too. Not that I necessarily want a CW Captain Marvel, but or Shazam, whatever they want to call it. It's just the same. Um, China DC says, new South Park episode tonight. You gonna watch it? No, I don't care about South Park anymore. I checked out a long time ago. I will say South Park seems to innovate itself. I even heard Red Letter Media was saying that like The Simpsons has gotten good recently, but my interest level in those shows are old. I used to watch that stuff as a kid, so I don't know. I just haven't really had as much interest these days. I think I've moved on personally. Not that I discount people who watch it. Like I've been watching Modern Family lately, so I'm hardly one to judge. Tevia is saying it may not be the level of Batman, X-Men, and Spider-Man, but Captain Marvel, yeah, Shazam's Rogues Gallery is still interesting. Johnny DC says, so are the lands dimensions or universes? I think they're like magical realms. Yeah, I like they're alternate universes, I guess, but more connected through like the Rock of Eternity along the lines of Thor and his realms. As far as universes go, I like it is kind of established that like in Marvel, the hell dimensions are alternate dimensions, but they do have certain portals and tethers to Earth and that sort of thing that make them a little different than the average alternate universe. And the magical realms are like that, unless I'm wildly mistaken. That's usually how these things go. It's whatever's kind of convenient for the story. From the perspective of characters like Shazam and the Wizard, they're magical realms, and they don't really think of these things in terms of alternate universes the way a character like Batman, the Flash, or Iron Man would. Which is just a neat little nuance of perspective. I think both things are true. Like they both exist in a valid shared universe. It's just a matter of how these different characters look at it based on where their power comes from and their belief system, I guess we'll say. But if you look at something like Grant Morrison's old map of the multiverse, it does include like space for hell and not technically realms like this, but I think we're kind of past the orrery at this point. Although I could be wrong. Maybe they are kind of different lands within the main universe so that they don't futz around with the number of Earths right now. But I I think we're beyond 52 Earths at this point. We just gotta wait on death metal now. Either way, I don't think it matters. It's the same rules either way. You can't just walk there. You need some sort of power or ability to do it. And I would also argue those magical lands probably not easily accessible by like the Flash's cosmic treadmill. You probably need magical abilities to do that, is my guess. But I don't know. I don't write this stuff. I think what's more of what it represents is you can go to one of those worlds in a story, and that's just a story arc. And it can be for Shazam or it can be for another character. These things are just out there now. Much like, other worlds or alternate universes in both Marvel and DC. Tevi is saying, plus death metal is expanding the multiverse. Oh yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm getting at. DC says, so wait, the realms are in the Rock of Eternity? No, I believe they're connected to the Rock of Eternity. Much like, I keep saying Otherworld, but that's because we just reviewed Axe of Swords. But just like much how it's like a connecting pathway. That's why I'm bringing up that comparison. You can think of it as like how the realms in like Thor's universe are connected through the World Tree or something like that, as far as I understand. But I could be wrong. The Rock of Eternity is a lot of things and has been different things over the years. So this is kind of my piecemeal impression of where the continuity currently is. And like I said, this series did kind of embark on a pretty serious drift towards the movies, I feel, but I think that's for the best. That movie had a pretty strong vision of how Shazam can work in the modern age and be a strong character and exist as Shazam as opposed to the more confusing Captain Marvel name. But we talked about that last review, and everyone loved my opinion of it, so we'll leave it at that. Um, yeah, next up we're going to talk about a new other series coming out because, you know, when one series ends, it's not like comics are going away or anything like that, and Marvel's put out a pretty cool series featuring a writer from way back when, showing off some cool talent. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.